Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Faraday Institute Research Seminar. My name is Keith Fox, and I'm the Director of Research at the Faraday Institute. It's a pleasure to welcome you and to welcome Hannah Waite, who will be giving this afternoon's seminar. Hannah works for Theos, which stimulates the debate about the place of religion in society, challenging and changing ideas through research, commentary, and events. Hannah joined Theos in 2019, and she's been working on the Science Religion project with Nick Spencer, who will actually be our seminar speaker in 2 weeks' time. And the Faraday Institute has been privileged to host this project, and it's been great to see the work that they've been doing over those 3 years. Hannah has an undergraduate degree in psychology and counselling and a PhD in practical theology, both of those from the University of Aberdeen. She's particularly interested in mental health, disability, and theology. I'm going to hand over to Hannah in a moment to give her seminar on Science and Religion is Gender an Issue. But before that, I'm going to ask Nick Spencer to say a few general words about the project to introduce that. So over to Nick, first of all, and then to Hannah. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Keith said, my name is Nick Spencer, and I work with Hannah and Keith on this project on science and religion. I want to give you, just by way of a brief introduction of how we got to the project before handing over to Hannah for the main event. It's not the first time that Theos has been in partnership with the Faraday Institute. As we see, next slide, if that's right, Hannah. We worked on a partnership back in 2009. 2009, as many of you will recall, was a big Darwin year. It was 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species, 200 years since Charles Darwin's birth. It was 3 years since Faraday and Theos were launched, but it was also 3 years since the publication of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. Very much then in the turbulent waters of the new atheist movement, for whom Charles Darwin was the intellectual pin-up boy. And back in 2007-8, we recognised that the Darwin anniversary might be used as an opportunity to argue that evolution necessitated atheism, and that isn't a legitimate view, we argued. It certainly wasn't a view that Charles Darwin himself held. And so we worked with the Faraday Institute and putting together a series of research programs and events to argue that the trench warfare that you see in front of you, in which you have certain figures like Dan Dennett, Chris Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, hurling tomes at equally entrenched creationists in the other trench who are hurling tomes back at them, was unnecessary for a debate of this nature, and it caught poor old Charles Darwin in a no man's land in between, from which he is being gallantly rescued by a Theos branded helicopter. Next slide, please. That was fun. And it was all part of an analysis of science and religion, which at that time had narrowed those two activities into evolution and creationism, bluntly. Following that, we were interested in exploring, in partnership again, the science and religion debate. But it wasn't until Peter Harrison published what I think is a seminal book a number of years later, The Territories of Science and Religion, that it struck us what we needed to engage with. Peter's book begins: if a historian were to contend that he or she had discovered evidence of a hitherto unknown war that had broken out in the year 1600 between Israel and Egypt, this claim would be treated with some skepticism. Peter's point there is, of course, that the territories that were latterly to become the sovereign states of Israel and Egypt existed in 1600, but the countries themselves didn't, the boundaries and the borders didn't. And in the same way, the activities that we would one day call religion and science existed in 1600, as indeed they did in 1200. But they were not clearly delineated. What science was and what religion was evolved and changed through time. Peter's book ends at the end of the 19th century, arguing that modern recognizable delineations of science and religion have become established by them. But even if that is the case, that does not mean that people necessarily use them in those ways. And so our project was effectively, we joked with our interviewees, a very long and very expensive way of trying to understand what two words mean or more precisely, how two words are used. What do people understand from science? What do people understand from religion? And in the light of that, what do they understand of the nature of the science and religion debate? Next slide, please. We did this through two ways. We interviewed a large number of experts, philosophers, scientists, people who wrote and researched on both topics. So some of the more eminent ones are there, from Brian Cox and Susan Greenfield to A.C. Grayling and Martin Rees and many others besides. And alongside that, we commissioned YouGov to conduct a very large quantitative survey, which asked nearly 240 questions and statements of over 5,000 UK adults, their opinion of a wide range of subjects that were related to the science and religion debate. The point of all this was to try and reframe it, to try and get some granularity, to try and understand what's actually going on, and to hear the conversations that were going on underneath the main conversation, or sometimes the main argument, of science and religion, and give a bit of airtime to those particular conversations. Next slide, please. We published this in our report, Science and Religion Moving Away from the Shallow End, a subtitle taken from that old adage that religions are a lot like swimming pools, all the noise is at the shallow end. Well, it's very much the case, we argued, for science and religion too. There's a lot of shouting and a lot of noise in the science and religion debate, but when you move away from that shallow end, you get to much more complex, more interesting, more fulfilling debates. And you also begin to hear voices that are otherwise obscured in the debate. Next slide, please. The topics we were honed in on in the end were to do with epistemology, metaphysics, hermeneutics, anthropology, ethics, and politics. And the argument in that report and in the project more generally is that we need to go beyond some of the tired dichotomies when it came to those. We need to go beyond naturalism versus supranaturalism, or faith versus fact, or literal versus metaphorical readings of authoritative texts. But as part of moving away from the overall science and religion headline debate, was involved the process of listening to other voices within that debate. And part of that led us to the topic that Hannah is going to be talking about in this particular seminar. Hannah, I think that's the right point for me to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And hello, everyone. Yes, so the discussion and the content of this seminar is informed by Bethany Sollerder's and Alistair McGrath's latest book, Emerging Voices in Science and Theology, Contributions by Young Women. So this is a piece of work that draws our attention to a persistent gender imbalance in science and theology. The volume engages with the absence and lack of representation of female voices in science and theology, and it seeks to rectify this imbalance by displaying the work of rising female scholars in the discipline of science and theology, but also in science and religion. In their introduction, Sollerder and McGrath highlight that men lead the world of science and theology. And this gender imbalance is not only true when it comes to science and theology, but also science and religion. The discipline of science and religion is one that often tends to be dominated by men. And I don't know about you, but it's not exactly a shocking revelation whenever we think of that, when we think of big heavy hitters in this domain, such as John Hedley Brooke, Alistair McGrath, Chris Southgate, Peter Harrison, and of course, some of our colleagues here at Faraday. Oh, sorry, I went down a slide when I wasn't supposed to. Obviously, the names that I just mentioned are not exhaustive, they're more illustrative, and I'm sure that there's many other people that we can think of that fit into that big heavy hitter category of science and religion, but normally they do seem to be men. There are some senior female figures in the field of science and religion, like Elaine Howard Eklund and Celia Dean Drummond, but it's clear in the words of Sollerder and McGrath that women are significantly and unacceptably underrepresented in the field of science and religion. So the focus of the seminar today is to think through how this gender different of engagement with this discipline is not only present in academic cultures as highlighted in this piece of work, but also how the gender imbalance in academia is reflected in grassroots level in society, and how actually this gender difference is a more pervasive issue. Before we continue, it's worth highlighting that the quantitative survey we commissioned YouGov for that Nick spoke about that had over 5,000 respondents, individuals were simply asked a question of which are you, male or female, and they also had the option of preferring not to answer. We didn't have any participants who chose not to answer, but we do recognise that sometimes this is judged to be an inadequate approach to categorising populations. There are papers by Westbrook and Saperstein called New Categories Are Not Enough, Rethinking the Measurement of Sex and Gender in Social Surveys, and by Sullivan, Sex in the Census, Why Surveys Should Not Conflate Sex, Gender and Identity, arguing that sex, gender and gender identity are three distinct categories with points of overlap, and that therefore the standard male-female division used in survey instruments can be misleading. And this is actually what was pointed out to us at a seminar last week. But for now, all we want to do is highlight that the term and the use of the terms male and female or men and women when discussing the results we have utilised as it's more consistent with the few pieces of current literature that explore the topics of science, religion, and male and female differences. Well, there are, I'm sure some people may argue that this may be a source of measurement error. We have no indication it was a problem for respondents, as everyone responded to this question and no one selected prefer not to say. So if we return back to the discussion of science and religion, Solar, Ritter and McGrath highlight that in recent publications of science and religion, only about 6 to 7% of authors are women. And even within that 6 to 7%, there's quite a lot of them where women are co-authoring with men. So actually the parameters get much smaller. And to me, as a woman now working in this area, it's not necessarily overly surprising, especially when it comes to my own reading and background and experiences in science and religion. I would say that the first time that I kind of became aware of how much of a difference there is in academia when it comes to science and religion and how men and women engage with that topic was actually at the very start of our science and religion project 3 years ago. I arrived in 2019, as Keith said, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed without an extensive knowledge or background in science and religion, which might explain my naivety and ignorance, I suppose, on the fact that there is a very pervasive gender imbalance in this area. In the first few months of our project, Nick and I began to identify leading academics and journalists who work on science and religion or have written extensively on science and religion. From the very beginning of our research project, when we were trying to identify our interviewees, we were very keen to try and get a gender divide that was close to 50-50 and try and get it equal. Now, this was quite difficult in a male-dominated field, but I don't think either of us anticipated just how hard it would be to find women in the field, let alone get women to want to speak to us. So we began hitting the phones, so to speak, writing emails and trying to arrange interviews. And this was difficult for a number of reasons, the most obvious being that there are significantly less women in this area. However, one of the things that we found more surprising was that women were less likely to agree to take part in our interviews. So some women stated that this might have been because they didn't have enough time with other academic commitments. We were conducting interviews in the midst of the first wave of COVID, so it might have been that childcare was an issue and they didn't have the time to sit down with us, or that genuinely, though a lot of the women were well qualified, they thought they didn't have much to say on the issue. That was actually the common theme, was that when we asked women to take part, we got replies saying, I will take part, but I doubt I'll be very helpful. This is quite different from men whenever we approached them to interview, who agreed and rarely, if ever, commented on their ability to speak into this area. So this struck Nick and me, as we were aware that a lot of women that we approached were very, very humble in their abilities. They were leading figures in their own respective disciplines, and we found that they were continually downplaying their own impressive CVs and contribution to this area and this discussion and our research. And actually, the conversations that we had with women in academics were just as valuable as conversations we had with men, as I'm sure all of you will agree. And yeah, after a lot of effort, we did manage to get a reasonable gender divide, though we weren't able to get a 50-50 split between men and women. We did manage to get a 60-40 ratio, with 40% of our 101 interviewees being women and 60% men. So part of the reason for this, as I keep drilling home, and I'm sure it's maybe getting a little bit repetitive, goes back to the fact that there's a lack of women in this field. For every one woman that we were able to approach and ask to take part in this research or asked to be an interviewee, there are easily another 2 to 3 men that we could have approached. And as we stated, it's actually was easier to get men to agree to be part of the research than it was for women. It's this difference, even at the very inception of this research and when we started looking for people, that made Nick and me think more seriously about how this gender difference might play out at a popular level. It was for this reason that when it came to our public opinion poll, that we decided it would be interesting to interrogate the data to see if there were any distinct gender differences. Overall, we found that there really is actually a gender difference in this whole issue of science and religion. And it's not just a question of men getting the spotlight, so to speak, or of more men being involved, but actually that our data showed that gender might directly influence one's opinions regarding science and religion. So to assess how and why this might be the case, we asked participants on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is incompatible and 10 is compatible, to indicate where they think the relationship between science and religion is. So just to put this graph into a bit of perspective, individuals who selected either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 were viewed as incompatible, and 6 to 10 as compatible. Responses of 1 and 2 were coded as being highly incompatible, and responses of 9 to 10 were viewed as highly compatible. So from the results here, we can see that we find that men were more likely to view science and religion as incompatible in comparison to women. Men not only displayed higher levels of generic incompatibility, with 60% of men viewing science and religion as incompatible versus 55% of women, but we also see that men present higher levels of strong incompatibility, meaning they either selected 1 or 2 on the 10-point scale. So this was 26% of men that viewed science and religion as highly/strongly incompatible versus 19% of women. Now, whenever Nick and I read this, we had wondered if this increased the level of compatibility we would see within women. You know, if men are more incompatible, does that mean women would be more compatible? However, as we can see from our results, we find that men and women, when it comes to science and religion, present the same levels of compatibility and high incompatibility. And that was an interesting and somewhat unexpected finding. We wondered if the gender difference in views of incompatibility and compatibility in science and religion was rooted actually in the use of the word religion itself. So, for example, is the reason that men perceive more incompatibility between science and religion due to the word religion itself and all the baggage that it carries with it. To examine if this was the case, we asked 3 similar 10-point scales about the perceived level of incompatibility between science and faith, science and Christianity, and science and Islam. And right now we're going to look at the difference between science and faith and science and Christianity. So to begin with, we find a similar trend when it came to how men and women view science and faith and science and Christianity, with men perceiving higher levels of incompatibility between science and faith. 51% of men view it as incompatible versus 43% of women, and science and Christianity, with 54% of men viewing it as incompatible versus 47% of women. And obviously we can also see that we see a mass increase in how men view science and faith and science and Christianity as highly incompatible. Again, we're seeing a similar trend here where men are viewing these two also as highly incompatible in comparison to women. So we find that men and women, again, here present similar levels of compatibility, while women are slightly higher in viewing science and faith or science and Christianity as compatible. It's only by 2 or 3%, so it's nothing significant. So whilst it's an interesting finding, the primary difference here is about how men and women view incompatibility rather than compatibility. In other words, men and women have broadly similar views on the compatibility of science and religion, science and faith, science and Christianity, but the real differences arise and are viewed when it comes to incompatibility and high levels of incompatibility. So when it came to asking people what they thought of the compatibility between science and Islam, the results were quite different from what we expected. We find that men are more likely than women to view science and Islam as incompatible, but they were also more likely to view it as compatible than women. Now, part of the reason for this was that 38% of women chose not to respond to this question by selecting I don't know. However, it's worth noting, or at least taking a small detour here, to say that although 38% of women chose not to answer this question, as did 25% of men. And this was a very telling finding for us, and it led us to look further into the questions that we had in our questionnaire about Islam. And overall, we find that individuals were more hesitant to respond to questions about Islam. Some of our questions in our questionnaire or survey were about religious literacy. For example, the Quran is written in Arabic. Some were a bit deeper on that religious literacy aspect, shall we say, in asking individuals on a scale from definitely true to definitely false, what do you believe about this statement? Muslims believe that the Quran was revealed to Muhammad by an angel. So we didn't find any gender differences here, but what we did find was that 43% of men and 46% of women chose not to answer this question. So simply, we find that fewer people will answer questions about Islam, but it seems that individuals who do answer questions about Islam are more confident in what they're saying and are more likely to choose extreme responses, be that in viewing Islam and science as highly incompatible or as highly compatible. So in this instance, it's worth noting that the hesitancy to answer questions between science and Islam was something that we found throughout the rest of the data. And to interrogate this further, we wanted to examine if how individuals respond to the view that science disproves religion more generally, and that science disproves Christianity and Islam in particular, contains a gender element. And we did this by asking individuals, did they think that science disproved religion, science disproves the Bible, or science disproves the Quran? And we find a similar trend, and one that we might have come to expect throughout the course of this presentation. We find that men are more likely to agree and in turn believe that science has disproved the Bible and the Quran, and that science has disproved religion. Additionally, the questions demonstrated that individuals felt more comfortable and able to comment on the question, science disproves religion and science disproves the Bible, than science disproves the Quran, with 32% of men and 45% of women choosing not to answer the question about science disproving the Quran, whereas less than 20% of men and women chose not to answer the question about science disproving religion or science disproving the Bible. Overall, what we have found is that there's a noticeable gender dimension to how individuals perceive the relationship between science and religion, science and faith, science and Christianity, and science and Islam. The consistent element in the difference that we find is that men are more likely to show strong hostility in these relationships than women are. So we began to wonder, why is this the case? Why are we finding this trend over and over again? And given that it is well documented in academic literature that women are more likely to be religious than men, we wanted to interrogate the data further to find if male hostility was due to female sympathy or female religious affiliation. So to examine this, we split up our data into 4 categories. So the first being non-religious men, non-religious women, and religious women. So religious in all of these cases is by self-definition. It's by individuals choosing that that's how they view themselves rather than through us assessing belief and behavior. But creating these new variables enabled us to assess if it is religious identity rather than gender that is driving some of the differences that we were seeing. When we compared the views of non-religious men and non-religious women, as we see here in the table, we find that there was still a gender difference when it comes to perceived levels of strong or high incompatibility. We find that religious men and women, we find that non-religious men and non-religious women respond similarly when it comes to levels of incompatibility and compatibility of the relationship between science and religion, science and Christianity, and science and Islam. We see more of a difference between levels of high incompatibility, and compatibility between science and faith when it comes to non-religious men and non-religious women. The gender difference in how men and women approach and understand the relationship between science and religion and science and faith in particular doesn't look as if it can be explained just by simply looking at religious affiliation. If non-religious men and non-religious women are more likely to see strong incompatibility between science and religion than religious groups, that's not really a surprise. But what was interesting was that non-religious men are more likely to see incompatibility than non-religious women. In other words, there is an irreducible gender dimension to how individuals approach and engage with this question. Men are simply much more likely to be antagonistic about the relationship between science and religion, and we began to think through why these high levels of incompatibility might be the case. In the first instance, we interrogated the data and discovered that this might be a result of the fact that men overall hold more negative views of religion in comparison to women. For example, men are twice as likely to agree that religion has no place in the modern world, with 32% of men agreeing with that statement versus 17% of women. That religion is a form of child abuse, with 22% of men agreeing that they view religion as a form of child abuse versus 10% of women. And we finally find that 29% of men versus 17% of women agree that religion is comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Now, that's a lot to take in. It's worth noting as well that these seem like quite strong statements, but the statement religion is comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate, or religion is a form of child abuse, have actually been statements that have been taken from public talks or published work of Richard Dawkins. So in this instance, from the data that we see here, it's clear to see that men appear to hold more negative views of religion more generally, but it also seems that there's a significant proportion of men that view religion as a form of evil in this world. They think of it as a deadly virus, as a form of abuse that individuals are subjecting their children to, and perhaps the wider society. So in this way, it becomes quite clear that what might be leading the view of hostility between science and religion for men is tightly entwined with their negative views on what religion is and their view that religion should not have a place in the modern world or within society. So after we realized that how individuals understand religion and its place in society is perhaps affecting how men respond to this question, we began to think through if attitudes to science also affect this. And we found that in general, men were more likely to be scientistic than women. And what I mean by this is that men are more likely to be driven by science in their outlook. For example, we find that 61% of men agree that science is the only reliable way to get knowledge about the world versus 49% of women. Men are also more likely to agree with the statement, science will be able to explain everything one day. 32% of men agree with this versus 27% of women. So it seems that men are more likely to not only be driven by science, but to think that it is the correct path to knowledge and truth. They think that science, as we find in the different question, is less affected by bias and error than other human activities. Kind of in the inverse, what we find was that women are more likely to agree that there are some things science will never be able to explain, with 68% of women agreeing with this versus 60% of men. So what this is showing us is that men are more likely to believe that science is a path to truth, an authoritative voice, and what they hinge a lot of their understanding of the world on in comparison to women. In this sense, we can begin to see here that not only do opinions of religion drive this debate, but so do opinions of science. For example, if you believe that science is the only reliable way to get knowledge about the world, and you also hold a negative attitude to religion, the tension between the two is going to be pretty much predetermined. And we suggest that one of the reasons that this difference occurs is due to the different epistemologies that it appears individuals subscribe to. From our data, what we have suggested and come to understand is that it appears men hold to a more scientific epistemology than women, and that could actually be what's influencing the debate. In our recent report, Science and Religion, Moving Away from the Shallow End, we suggested that one of the core components that drives the science and religion debate is actually epistemology. So in our research, in talking with experts, we became aware that individuals don't always disagree with one another about content in science and religion. Obviously, that is a significant part on why individuals disagree, but it can also be heavily based on what knowledge and voices someone takes as authoritative and truthful. And this seems to be the case for gender differences too. For example, we witness that men are indeed more likely to hold a more scientific or scientistic epistemology. What we mean by this is that men more readily hold to the view that empiricism, logic, evidence, and rational processes are the most authoritative voices in the path to truth and in enabling us to understand the world around us. In this sense, it means that men often hold a more positivistic attitude to science. They are more likely, as we've seen, to believe that science is the only way of getting reliable knowledge about the world, or that science will one day be able to explain everything. And what we find is that individuals who do hold this more scientific epistemology also tend to have more negative views about science and religion and about religion more generally. Women, on the other hand, appear to have a more pluralistic epistemology and believe that there are many other ways to understand the world around us. This isn't women saying that science is not important or science is not an authoritative voice, but that it is one of the authoritative voices that we can pay attention to. And this is seen in the fact that more women than men agree that there are some things science will never be able to explain, that more women than men believe that science ultimately needs faith to work, because you need to have faith in your science and the experiment you're putting forward, or even the fact that more women believe that scientists should be open to using miracles to explain their findings. Pardon me. We find that in our report, regardless of gender, the more pluralistic an epistemology that an individual holds, the more positive they are about religion, and the more positive they are about science and religion, and the more likely they are to view science and religion as compatible. This then indicates that because women adhere to a more pluralistic epistemology, that they are more likely to think of science and religion as compatible in comparison to men. We propose then that the way we think about religion and knowledge, and how we acquire knowledge, actually really affects how we think about the science and religion debate. And how does this then relate to our understanding of science and religion, science and gender, religion and gender, and science, religion and gender. Firstly, and perhaps the most obvious, is that our research supports existing literature that demonstrates men are often more scientific than women or more involved in the sciences than women. Women are underrepresented in science, especially when it comes to elite academic positions. This is something that we've heard time and time again, especially whenever we see the recruitment of trying to get women into STEM subjects. So our data highlights that though this is a difference that's often discussed at an academic level, there's also a difference at a popular level of discourse, and it demonstrates that men are still more likely at that popular societal level to lean towards scientism or scientific endeavors. So this demonstrates that not only is there this gender dimension in literature, but that it's also in society. When it comes through thinking how this affects our understanding of religion and gender, our findings show that women are more sympathetic to religion, and it actually supports this larger body of work from a new angle. That is that throughout academic literature, it's documented that women are often more religious than men or more sympathetic to religion. And this is especially true when it comes to the West. With that in mind, our research highlights that women have higher levels of sympathy to religion and to the science and religion and to the science and religion debate. Women are more likely to view science and religion, science and faith, and science and Christianity as compatible. And we found that this was still the case when we compared non-religious men against non-religious women. Non-religious women are still more sympathetic to religion than non-religious men. And we believe that part of the reason for women viewing science and religion as being less incompatible in comparison to men is not only because of religious sympathy, but also because of women holding more positive view of religion more generally and its place in society and this pluralistic epistemology. Finally, the research of science and religion, as I'm sure a lot of us know here, is a globally emerging field. However, historically, it has been a field of study that has been predominantly discussed by men, especially men in the West. So not only is the study of science and religion an emerging and growing field, but the combination of studying science, religion, and gender is one that hasn't really been examined yet. In this way, our research is seeking to do two things. One is it's seeking to contribute to the wider research project and research projects that are trying to expand the horizons and understandings of the science and religion landscape. And it does this by highlighting that gender can actually play a very prominent role in how individuals view this discipline and engage with it. Secondly, our research is seeking to pay particular attention to voices that are otherwise often unheard, that is women's voices. We are seeking to pay particular attention to women's voices and opinions in an area where they are often overlooked. So it's the hope then that this piece of research will highlight the need for more female voices in this discipline, and that the popular level view of conflict and incompatibility that often overshadows the science and religion conversation is one that is actually predominantly male. So if we are to understand this field of study more completely, it means that we need to give more voice to female opinions, and recognizing that this dominant narrative of conflict, hostility, and antagonism that those of us who are often in this world of science and religion face at a popular level is actually often dictated by male voices. And that if we pay attention purely to that argument of conflict, we are lacking the nuance that is present actually when we look at how gender can influence this debate. And that is me. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for a fascinating talk and presented lots and lots of data. There's lots of things for us to take in on that and assimilate. We'll have a time for questions. Can I remind people, put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Maybe I could start with a couple that have appeared on there, which are more technical in detail relating to the data themselves. Is that sometimes in your data, the incompatible and the incompatible don't add up to 100%. Why is that?
That will be because there will have been some individuals who will have selected don't know or chose not to answer the question.
Okay, thank you. And the other one is the size of the data sets. So when you talk about things being highly incompatible, what is the sample size? So the difference between men and women in that, how significant are they?
I would need to look up the data right now just to know it off the top of my head, because I'm sure, as you can imagine, it's hard to remember all the different points and sample sizes, but I will do that now.
Okay, yeah, that's quite helpful.
Just as a PS to that, Kate, it's also worth emphasising that the highly incompatible scores are 1 and 2. They were calculated from people who ticked 1 and 2. The incompatible scores are ticked from people who ticked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so that was the question we got asked last week, that might be another reason why the figures didn't add up to 100, because there's effectively a double counting going on there.
So it was, if we're just looking at the sample size of men who chose highly incompatible on the question about science and religion, it was 656 men who viewed it as incompatible versus 498 women.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. There's a question about gender bias in science and religion. Often in schools. Is there anything that schools can do to redress that gender bias in both science and in religion? And what sort of things would be most effective?
I think one of the most effective things, if I'm able to speak of personal experience, actually was that I went to a school in which we only had one female science teacher. And actually I enjoyed it more whenever I saw that there was another woman teaching it. And I don't know why that was, but I wonder as well if that might be part of it too, because it did feel very much whenever, it was the men in the science room, they just got to play with the Bunsen burners basically and all carried on, whereas everyone seemed to pay a bit more attention. I don't know if that's due to her or due to it being a woman and it being something different, but I think that there's ways in which to encourage people to go into different disciplines and to think differently. And I suppose that's quite hard because historically it's went from it being quite a male dominated area. I'll let Nick, because I think he had something to say there too.
The only thing I would say is that if science and religion is taught, as it sometimes is in schools, or encountered as it sometimes is, as a competition between two different sets of propositions about the way the world is, effectively in a kind of a zero-sum game or combative form, conflict is built into it, and you automatically head down this line that Hannah's been drawing out in the research, which is effectively more of a male line. Whereas if it is taught more discursively, as if there doesn't have to be a winner or a loser, and these aren't competing systems, I think it's going to appear less combative, it's going to be less confrontational, and it will appeal more to people who are inclined towards a dialogic approach. And as we've seen again from the data, that is disproportionately female over male. So that would just tilt the scale slightly, I suspect.
Thank you for that. There's another question about cultural differences, and access to education is and higher education particularly, is rather limited in some cultures. And that also then starts to relate to issues of power. Did any of that come across in the data that you collected?
Not that I've seen. I'll let Nick come in if he has anything to say. But not that I've seen, and I think it's worth noting as well, obviously, it's for the UK. So yes, there's different cultures, but this is just a UK sample. So I'm sure that we would find realer differences if you were to look at how that transpires in different countries. I know Elaine Howard-Eklund has a research paper that looks at the levels of academic elite scientists and gender, and that looks at how men and women differ in those areas across the UK, the US, Italy, Turkey. I think there's one or two other countries. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Just to add to that briefly, our survey was obviously only UK based, so we didn't have any comparison there. I was, as it happens, coincidentally looking at a Pew Forum data set earlier on today, looking at the perceived relationship between science and religion around the world. It's a few years old now. The tension seems to be quintessentially quite a Western phenomenon, quite a Christendom phenomenon. I think that's probably because, as many people who studied the history of science and religion will recognize, that narrative developed in the late 19th century when there is effectively a significant social battle over public authority between emerging science as discipline and actually in particular the Catholic Church in the last third of the 19th century. In cultures where that pre-existing power struggle wasn't present, I don't think they quite inherited that model of tension. So I suspect, as the question points out, power and culture do play a very significant role in that. But there's not a great deal, to the best of my knowledge, of comparable data on the topic.
Thank you both. I wonder if your data enable you to be able to subdivide things into, at least in terms of the respondents, into those who are religious and those who are non-religious scientists, or had a science background as opposed to no particular higher education in science.
Yeah, we are able to do that. And we did look at that, or I did look at that, and there wasn't actually a strong difference there in gender in comparison to how they viewed things, if they had a scientific background or not. And if there was differences, it was at a very small level. So at master's level or at PhD level, where our sample sizes were less than 100 people, so we couldn't draw any conclusive arguments from that.
Yeah, I mean, a related issue on that is to the level of science education that your respondents had. I think in your questions, you may have asked some probing questions to find out whether people actually understood much science anyway. Yeah. Was there a correlation between their scientific understanding? Generally, does ignorance of science mean greater antagonism or less?
I think it depends. It definitely, if people are, you can see it in two ways, if you know what I mean. So it does show that people who have lower understanding of science might be more likely to view science and religion as incompatible, but then people with very, very high levels of understanding of science and are also not religious view it as strongly incompatible. So there's a lot of demographic aspects that also influence it. We can't just categorize it very simply because the results just go all over the place, unfortunately, because it would be easier to answer your question either with a yes or no, Keith, to be honest.
I would just quickly add to that a couple of things. We asked our qualitative interviewees some of the same questions we asked of our quantitative ones, primarily so that we could be able to categorize them. We did ask them this 10-point scale question, which itself was quite interesting because I think we gave them, it was basically a preparatory, largely demographics questionnaire in advance. So when they came to the interviews, I think they were expecting to be asked quite noddy and toyland questions. And so when it didn't turn out like that, they were quite surprised. But when we did ask them noddy and toyland questions, basically the 10-point scale stuff, what was really interesting was that despite the fact that the general population as a whole had a 2-to-1 imbalance in favor of incompatibility over compatibility, the expert interviews we conducted had a 2-to-1 balance of compatibility over incompatibility. And why that was particularly striking was not simply because they were educated, but we deliberately selected them to be disproportionately not religious and disproportionately atheist. Because in the first turn, our interest was discovering what the problem was, effectively what are people disagreeing about, and therefore it's much easier to interview people who do have a problem, who are disagreeing about something. So we went for people who were disproportionately not religious, disproportionately atheist, and of course disproportionately highly educated in both, and yet they still came back feeling science and religion were more compatible than the population as a whole. Now, I don't want to draw too secure a conclusion from 100 sample, but indicative, I thought that was very interesting.
That's fascinating, fascinating. Can almost a quick yes, no, is there any difference in age? Does that have an effect on people's views of compatibility and incompatibility?
Yes, but again, only for men. We find that men over the age of 50 are more likely to view science and religion as incompatible than men under the age of 50.
Okay, thank you. And you've bundled together everything under the general umbrella of science. Can you drill that down into narrower areas? Typically, the more mathematical, physical areas of science, I think, are more dominated by men, whereas there's far more women in the more biological and social science areas. Are you able to drill down into any greater depths with those specific sciences?
We were and weren't in a specific way, in that we asked individuals, do you think being a Christian makes it harder to be a neuroscientist, or certain things like that, or does cosmology make it harder to believe in Islam, or certain ways? It wasn't phrased exactly like that, but apart from that, we just left science as quite a broad category because we didn't want to confuse the general public. As Nick said, our interviews of talking about science, and our first question was, how do you define science, to anyone who took part in our research interviews. So actually we felt that trying to provide definitions of science or draw those out could be more confusing, and we were more worried about people not then completing the questionnaire, because we were trying to, we had over 200 questions or something, Nick, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. I was just, when you were talking, I was just kind of trying to scan through the data to see if there's any data points I could specifically pick up for that. I haven't been able to, but just picking up from that case, one thing is worth emphasising was that the perceived hostility between science and religion, it didn't quite disintegrate, but it fell apart significantly when you started speaking about specific sciences and religion. So in exactly the same way as Hannah talked about, if you ask people about science and specific religions, the hostility is modified slightly. If you ask people about the difference between religion and neuroscience or psychology or geology or whatever it is, it's much more balanced. So I think any gender difference that still exists when you're asking at that level of granularity is going to be overshadowed by the fact that simply by focusing on a specific scientific discipline, the entire framing of hostility begins to fall apart.
Okay, thank you. There's a question, somebody says that this is fascinating. Is there a similar issue in terms of what they call digital religion, in that people who are technical techies tend to be male dominated?
I do not know. I'm sure that there probably is, but unfortunately we don't have the data for it. But Nick looked quite excited by that question.
No, only because it's one of those questions that we don't have the data for, so we could just kind of extemporize and no one can prove us wrong on this. Intuitively, it kind of makes sense. I mean, there is an absolute mountain of data, as Hannah has talked about, on the correlation between women and religiosity. I suspect there is quite a lot of data, although nothing like as much, on the way in which the tech scene is predominantly or more heavily dominated by men. If you kind of triangulate those points, you're going to get some kind of connection there. So I suspect there is a link, but it's working properly as researchers, as Hannah has done, and we don't have data to say one way or the other.
Thank you. It's a slightly longer question, but I think I see where it's going. Is given that science has persuasive arguments supporting God the Creator, as well as convincing arguments supporting a purely materialistic epistemology, do you have any data on the gender split in the compatible category between, compatible category between those two categories? Sorry, so it gets a bit convoluted, that question, towards the end, but the purely materialistic as compared to persuaded that there is an argument for the existence of God. Is there a gender split in the compatible between those two categories?
I don't think we've got data for it, to be honest with you. I'm not 100% sure I saw the link between the first part and the second part of the question. I may be being obtuse here. Would you mind just reading it out again, just in case I've misunderstood it? Or
Yes, I mean, you may be able to see it on your screen as well, Nick, but let me read it through exactly. Given that science has persuasive arguments supporting God the Creator, as well as supporting a purely materialistic epistemology, do you have any data on the gender split in the compatible category between those two categories?
I don't think so, is the answer. The only thing I would say there is that, picking up on your previous question, when you break down science into different scientific disciplines, as I said, the hostility disintegrates, or at least is far more balanced, and very, very few people see specific scientific discipline is more likely to be a barrier to religious belief than less likely. The only exception to that is cosmology / the Big Bang, where people, it's more evenly balanced. People tend to see, men and women, but men slightly more than women, tend to see Big Bang cosmology as an active barrier to religious belief, though it's still quite evenly balanced. I suspect that's because there is this slightly more male buy-in to the idea that Big Bang is an alternative materialistic description for the origins of the universe as opposed to God. And so they interpret that along that materialistic way. And there is, I think, a slight male imbalance there. But that's just a kind of a peripheral answer to a question that I don't think we have good data on. I'm looking for Hannah for confirmation there.
I also think if we did have data, it would involve a lot more statistical analysis, and it's not at the moment. We're kind of still wading through the waters, shall we say, of trying to get top line views at the moment.
And it is also worth doing a very quick PS to give you a window on some of the discussions we had with YouGov when we were designing the questionnaire, when they tended to be along the lines of, we'd like to ask this, and YouGov said, you can't ask that. You cannot realistically ask that to a general population. It's actually quite a serious point that, as they said, we were at the absolute limits of what you can legitimately ask a general public on these issues, because let's not forget, the majority of the general public do not spend more than a minute a week thinking about these issues. So asking about neuroscience was pushing it. Epistemology might have been a bridge too far.
Great, thank you. I think at that point we'll draw our discussion to a close. It's been, I think, as a scientist, comforting to hear two people say we don't have the data, we can't answer that. There's nothing in the science to be ashamed of and saying, I don't know, but I'll go away and find out. Thank you for your honesty in that. You've given us a remarkable insight into an area that I think maybe we haven't given a lot of thought to this afternoon. And we're really grateful for that. Our conversation will continue. And maybe everybody can join me in a virtual round of applause for Hannah particularly, and for Nick